The plow hit something hard beneath the Wyoming soil, and Eleanor Cross nearly went down with it. 7 months along her belly straining against the worn fabric of her dress, she caught herself on the leather reins and held. 3 rows left. She told herself that every morning. 3 rows, then water, then rest. She had not rested properly in 4 months. She was not certain she remembered how. The mule pulled steady, and Eleanor pulled back, and somewhere between the ache in her back and the fire in her chest, she decided she was not going to lose this land. Not today. Not ever. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very last word. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. Eleanor Cross had learned 3 things about grief in the 14 months since she buried her husband. The first was that grief did not announce itself politely. It arrived the way a Wyoming winter arrived, without warning, without mercy, and with every intention of staying longer than you could bear. The second was that people stopped seeing you as a person the moment your husband went into the ground. They started seeing a problem, a question, a piece of unfinished business that needed to be resolved before it inconvenienced the rest of the county. The third thing she had learned was the most important. Grief could be plowed through. Literally. You put your hands on the reins, you leaned your weight into the handles, and you pushed forward into the earth until the earth gave way. You did not think about the baby pressing against your ribs. You did not think about the letter sitting on the table inside the cabin, the one with Silas Holt's name printed neat and official across the top. You thought about the row in front of you. Just the row in front of you. "Come on, Luther," she said to the mule. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "One more." Luther flicked his ear and pulled. Eleanor had been awake since 4 in the morning. She had eaten half a biscuit and drunk 2 cups of water and told herself that was enough. She knew it was not enough. The baby shifted, and she pressed one hand briefly against her side, steadying herself, then put it back on the reins. She did not hear the horse until it was close. Too close. She let go of one rein and reached for the small pistol she kept tucked in her apron pocket. James had taught her to shoot 3 weeks after they arrived in Wyoming, back when she still thought the frontier was an adventure. She had gotten very good at it. "Easy, ma'am." The voice came from behind and to her right. Male. Low. Careful in a way that told her the man attached to it had been around people who startled badly. Eleanor did not turn around. "State your business or ride on." "I was going to offer to help." "I didn't ask for help." "No, ma'am, you didn't." A pause. "That's why I'm offering, instead of waiting to be asked." She turned then, one hand still on the reins, the other keeping the pistol visible, without quite pointing it at him. The man sitting the bay horse at the edge of her field was lean and dark-haired, somewhere in his middle 30s, with the kind of face that had been weathered by years of moving through hard country. He wore a dark brown vest over a shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, a hat that had seen better decades, and a revolver on his hip that he had made no move toward. His hands were visible and open. He was looking at her the way a careful man looked at something he did not want to spook. His eyes went to her belly and then back to her face without lingering, which she noted. "You're on my land," Eleanor said. "I stopped at the fence line." He nodded toward the road. "Watched you for about a minute before I came in. Didn't want to startle you." "You startled me." "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry for that." He didn't move. Off the horse, didn't push forward. "My name is Marsh Calloway. I'm not passing through looking for trouble." "What are you passing through looking for?" Something shifted behind his eyes. Not evasion exactly. More like a man choosing his words the way you chose your footing in uncertain ground. "I was looking for a piece of land about 2 miles east of here. Fellow named Holt said he'd acquired it last spring." Eleanor's hand tightened on the reins. "Holt. You know him." "I know of him." She kept her voice flat. "What's your business with Silas Holt?" Marsh Calloway looked at her for a long moment. Then he swung down from the horse, slow and deliberate, keeping his hands away from his sides. He looped the reins around his saddle horn and took 2 steps toward the fence. No more than 2. "I used to work for the railroad," he said. "Survey and acquisition. I spent 4 years moving through territories like this one, filing reports on land disputes, boundary claims, homestead status." He paused. "And I spent those same 4 years watching a man named Silas Holt follow about 6 counties behind me, using information from those reports to put pressure on homesteaders who were behind on their notes." Eleanor did not say anything. The mule shifted, and she steadied him automatically, her eyes staying on Marsh. "I quit that job 8 months ago," Marsh said, "after I saw what happened to a family in Chouteau County, a widow woman and her 2 sons. Holt had a note on her property that she swore she'd already paid off. By the time the lawyers were done with it, she was gone, and Holt had 40 acres of good bottomland." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I rode past the Clearwater Land Office 2 days ago, and I saw your name, Mrs. Cross, on a list of properties Holt's office has flagged for acquisition review." He said it plainly, without embellishment. "And because I'm standing here watching a woman 7 months pregnant work a field alone at 7 in the morning, and I've got a feeling I know why." Eleanor turned back to Luther. She adjusted the reins. She breathed through her nose slow and even, the way she did when she needed to think without letting the panic in. "You need to finish that row," Marsh asked. "I need to finish 3 rows. "Then let me take the reins while you tell me about the letter." She looked at him sharply. "How did you know about a letter?" "Because that's how Holt works. He sends the letter first. Friendly, concerned. Tells you he's noticed you might be struggling, and he wants to help." Marsh's voice was even, but there was something hard underneath it. "By the time people realize what he's actually doing, it's too late to fight it properly." Eleanor stared at him. She had received the letter 11 days ago. She had read it 4 times. The language had been exactly as he described, friendly, concerned, helpful. It had made her skin crawl in a way she couldn't quite articulate until this moment. "How do I know you're not working for him?" she said. "You don't." Marsh met her eyes steadily. "That's a fair question, and I don't have a clean answer for it. All I've got is what I'm telling you, and what you can verify for yourself if you're willing to let me show you what I have." "What do you have?" "Documents. Copies I made before I left the railroad company. Records of Holt's acquisition pattern going back 3 years. He reached into the front pocket of his vest slowly and produced a folded piece of paper. He held it out across the fence. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to look at this." Eleanor looked at the paper. She looked at the man holding it. She thought about the letter on her table, the one she had read 4 times, and still couldn't quite identify what was wrong with it, only that something was. She thought about James, who had taught her to shoot, but had never taught her to ask for help because James hadn't believed a person ought to need it. She walked to the fence and took the paper. It was a property transfer record. Clearwater County, Montana Territory. The names on it meant nothing to her. But the structure of the transaction, she read it twice, and her stomach went cold. "This transfer fee," she said. "It's dated 6 months before the original loan was issued." Marsh blinked. "Most people miss that. Most people aren't looking at the dates." She scanned the document again. He used the transfer fee to create a secondary lien. If the original note was paid off, the lien on the transfer fee would still stand. She looked up. "That's not a mistake. Someone constructed this deliberately." Marsh was looking at her differently now. "You understand title documents." "I understand numbers." She handed the paper back through the fence. "My father was an accountant in Cincinnati. I kept his books from the time I was 12 years old." She paused. "I've been keeping my own books since James died. I know what my note says. I know what I've paid and when." She paused again, and her voice went tight in a way she didn't entirely intend. "What I can't figure out is what Holt changed and where." "Show me your copy of the original loan agreement," Marsh said, "and your payment records." She looked at him for a long moment. The morning sun was climbing, and her back ached with a steady grinding persistence that she had learned to ignore. The baby was quiet, which usually meant he or she was sleeping, which usually meant she had about an hour before the movement started again, and sitting still became uncomfortable. "Luther still needs 3 rows, she said. Marsh stepped over the fence. "I'll do the rows. You don't know how he handles. I've been working mules since I was 9 years old." He held out his hand for the reins, not grabbing, just offering. "You can stand right there and watch if you want. Make sure I don't ruin your lines." She did not hand over the reins immediately. She stood holding them and studied him the way she had learned to study everything in the last 14 months, looking for the angle, the thing underneath the thing. The reason a person was doing what they appeared to be doing. James had always said she was too suspicious. James had been too trusting, and James was dead, and the land they had broken their backs over for 3 years was on a list in Silas Holt's office. She handed over the reins. "Keep him straight," she said. "He drifts left if you let up." "Yes, ma'am." She stepped back from the plow, and the relief that moved through her lower back was so immediate and so profound that she had to press her lips together to keep from making a sound. She put her hand on her belly. The baby shifted. "How long have you been working this field alone?" Marsh asked. He had Luther moving already, his hands settled on the reins with the ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "Since April." "That's 5 months. I'm aware of the math." He didn't say anything to that. He kept the line straight. She watched him and tried to decide if she was making a catastrophic mistake. "You said Holt follows the railroad reports," she said. "What was in your report about my land?" "Good soil, water access from Bitter Creek, southern exposure. The cabin's small, but the bones of the property are strong." He didn't look back at her. "Prime homestead land. The kind that'll be worth 3 times what it is now once the railway spur comes through." "What railway spur?" He was quiet for a moment. "There's a spur planned for this valley. It's not public knowledge yet. Won't be for another year, probably. But the railroad knows, which means the people who read railroad reports know." He reached the end of the row and turned Luther with a practiced hand. "Holt's not after your 40 acres, because he's a banker who wants his money back, Mrs. Cross. He's after it because in 18 months, whoever owns this land is going to be able to sell it for enough money to buy 100 acres somewhere else." Eleanor stood still. The wind moved through the grass around the field, and the mule huffed, and Marsh Calloway started the second row, and she stood there, doing the arithmetic in her head with the cold, clear part of her brain that did not panic, that only calculated. "He's doing this to how many properties?" she said. "In this valley I count 7 that fit his pattern. Yours is the one he's moved on most recently, which means you've got more time than the others did." He paused. "Not a lot of time, but some." "I need to see all of it," she said. "Everything you have, every document." "That's why I'm here." "And what do you want in return?" He stopped the mule. He turned and looked at her directly the way he had not quite done since he got down from the horse. "I want to put Silas Holt in front of a judge," he said. "I've been carrying documents for 8 months trying to figure out how to do that without getting myself killed or discredited. I need someone who can read what I have and explain it in a way that a judge will understand." He looked at her steadily. "You just read a fraudulent title document in 30 seconds and identified the mechanism of the fraud. I've shown that document to 4 other people, and none of them caught it." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "You need my brain," she said. "Yes, ma'am, I do." She had not expected that. She had expected a man looking for something she could give him in exchange for the kind of help that required her to be passive and grateful. She had not expected to be told plainly, and without flattery, that she had something he needed and could not replace. "Finish the rows," she said. "Then come inside and I'll show you the loan agreement." He nodded and turned back to Luther and started the 3rd row without another word. Eleanor walked toward the cabin. Her back was still aching and her feet hurt, and she was aware with the weary practicality that had replaced most of her other feelings in the last year that she had just invited a stranger into her home based on 40 seconds of conversation and one piece of paper. James would have told her she was being reckless. Ruth Blackwood, her neighbor 3 miles east, would have told her the same thing, and then added several pointed remarks about the specific foolishness of trusting a man who showed up uninvited. But Ruth also would have looked at that document. And Ruth also would have understood the way Eleanor now understood, with bone-deep certainty, that a woman with a 7-month belly and a fraudulent lien on her land could not afford to refuse the one person who had walked up to her fence and told her the truth about what she was up against. She pulled Silas Holt's letter from the table and sat down in the chair beside the window where the light was best. She read it again. This time, knowing what she now knew, she found it in the 3rd paragraph. A reference to the original loan amount that was $2.30 higher than the number in her own records. $2.30. A rounding error. A transcription mistake. The kind of thing a person might look at and decide they had miscalculated themselves rather than accuse a banker of tampering with. Her hand was steady as she set the letter down. Her hands had been steady for 14 months. She had made them steady through practice and stubbornness, and the absolute refusal to let anything, not grief, not exhaustion, not fear, make her fingers shake. She heard the mule stop outside. She heard Marsh Calloway walking Luther to the lean-to, speaking to him quietly, in the way of someone who knew that animals responded to tone. She got up and put the kettle on. When he came to the door, he knocked. He did not walk in. She noted that. "Come in," she said. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the room, doing what she guessed was the same calculation she had done about him reading the space for what it told him about the person who lived in it. The shelves of books. The ledger open on this table beside 3 years of payment receipts organized by date. The cradle in the corner that she had built herself from cottonwood branches over the course of 3 weeks because her hands had needed something to do in the evenings. He sat down at the table when she gestured to the chair. She put 2 cups of coffee on the table and sat down across from him and put her hand flat on the loan agreement. "I found the discrepancy," she said. $2.30 in the 3rd paragraph of Holt's letter. He's adjusted the original loan figure. Marsh looked at her. "When did you get that letter?" 11 days ago. "And you've been working the field every morning since then?" "The field doesn't care about Silas Holt," she said. "It still needs plowing." Something moved across his face. Not pity. She would have stood up and asked him to leave if it had been pity. It was something else, something she didn't have a name for yet, but that made her feel for the first time in a very long time that the person sitting across from her was seeing her clearly. "I have 9 documents in my saddlebag," Marsh said. "The fraudulent title record I showed you, and 8 others. Each one shows a different piece of how he constructs the scheme. The problem is that individually they look like administrative errors. You need someone who can read all 9 together and show the pattern." He put his coffee cup down. "How long would that take you?" Eleanor looked at the loan agreement on the table. She looked at the letter. She thought about the $2.30. "Give me the documents," she said. "I'll tell you tonight." He went to his horse and came back with a leather satchel and put it on the table between them without ceremony. She pulled it toward her and opened it and took out the first document. She started reading. Outside, the Wyoming morning moved on around them, the wind in the grass, the chickens in their yard, the sound of Bitter Creek running somewhere in the distance. Eleanor Cross sat at her dead husband's table with her unborn child pressing against her ribs and read through 9 documents that told her piece by piece exactly how a man named Silas Holt had been stealing land from people who did not know they were being stolen from. By the time she reached the 7th document, she knew she could stop him. By the 9th, she knew how. She looked up at Marsh Calloway, who had been sitting across from her without speaking for 2 hours, drinking 2 cups of coffee and waiting. "He made a mistake," she said. Marsh leaned forward slightly. "Where?" She laid 3 of the documents side by side on the table and pointed to a set of figures in the lower margin of each. He used the same transfer fee calculation in all three of these. Same number, down to the cent. She looked at him. That's not how transfer fees work. They vary by property value and transaction date. 3 different properties, 3 different years, the exact same fee. She tapped the paper. He had a formula. He stopped calculating individually at some point and started applying a fixed amount, because he was moving too fast and got careless. Marsh stared at the documents. If we can establish that pattern across all 9, we can establish it across all 9, Eleanor said. Give me until morning. He was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Cross, he said carefully, you understand that when we take this to a judge, Holt is going to come after you. Not with lawyers, with whatever else he's got. I understand that. You're 7 months pregnant. I'm aware of that too. She met his eyes. Mr. Calloway, I have been fighting this man alone for 11 days with nothing but my own records and the sick feeling in my stomach that something was wrong, but I couldn't find it. Now I can find it. She folded her hands on the table. I am not going to sit on what I can find because I'm scared of what Holt might do. If I do that, I lose the land anyway. I just lose it more slowly and more quietly. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. All right, she said. Outside, the afternoon light was shifting toward gold, and Eleanor Cross pulled the first document toward her and picked up her pen. She worked through the night. Marsh had offered to sleep in the barn, and she had not argued with him about it, which surprised her a little. She was not accustomed to accepting things without arguing. James had called it her best quality and her worst one, depending on which side of it he was standing on. But she was tired in a way that went deeper than bone, and the documents were spread across the table in 3 overlapping rows, and she did not have the energy to waste on arguing about where a man she barely knew was going to sleep. She lit the second lamp at 9 o'clock and kept working. The baby moved at 10, a slow rolling shift that had become familiar over the past 2 months. She pressed her palm flat against her side and waited until it stilled. She had gotten into the habit of talking to the baby in the evenings, quiet and low, the kind of conversation she would have been embarrassed to have in front of anyone. She did not do it tonight. Tonight, she needed to think. The fixed transfer fee appeared in 7 of the 9 documents. Not all 9 Holt had been more careful in the early transactions, which told her something about when he had stopped being careful and why. The 2 early documents showed variable fees properly calculated. Then something had changed. The 3rd transaction was the pivot point, the fee locked, and from that point forward, it never varied by so much as a cent across 4 different counties and 6 different property values. She wrote the numbers down in 2 columns. Left column, what the fee should have been based on standard territory calculation. Right column, what Holt had charged. The difference ranged from 40 cents to $3.12 per transaction. Small enough to look like rounding. Large enough when you applied the discrepancy to the secondary lien structure to create a technical default that had never actually occurred. It was elegant in the way that truly vicious things were sometimes elegant. She hated that she could see the elegance of it. At some point past midnight, she became aware that she was not alone in the room. She did not startle. She had heard him come in the soft sound of boots on the board floor, the careful way he moved so as not to wake her if she had fallen asleep at the table. She kept her eyes on the document in front of her. "You should be sleeping," she said. "Couldn't." Marsh pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He had taken off his vest and his hat, and without them, he looked younger and also more tired. "How far are you?" 7 documents charted, 2 to go. She pushed the left-hand column toward him. "Look at the variance pattern." He looked at it. She watched his face while he did. He was not a fast reader, but he was a careful one. She could see him going back, checking, not moving to the next line until he was sure of the last one. "The pivot is the 3rd transaction," he said. "April 1876. What changed in April 1876?" He was quiet for a moment. That was when the railroad survey started in this region. I filed my first report on Bitterroot Valley properties in May of that year. So he got access to your reports, and he started moving faster than he could manage carefully. She pulled the column back. He's a precise man who got greedy. Precise men who get greedy always leave a trail. They can't help it. The precision is still there. It's just pointed in the wrong direction. Marsh put his elbows on the table. When you say you can stop him, what exactly are you thinking? I'm thinking that if I can produce a clear accounting analysis showing the fixed fee pattern across all 9 transactions, with the correct calculations alongside, and demonstrate that the resulting discrepancies created artificial defaults in at least 4 of these cases, a territorial judge would have grounds to void the liens. She paused. The problem is that Holt will argue the discrepancies are clerical errors. We need something that proves intent. The timing, Marsh said. The correlation between my survey reports and his acceleration. That's circumstantial. I've got a letter, he said. She looked up from the documents. He reached into the inside pocket of his shirt and produced a second piece of paper, more creased than the others, the kind of crease that came from being folded and unfolded many times. He put it on the table between them. I took this from the railroad company's files the day I quit, he said. It's from Holt to the Regional Acquisitions Director. Written in January 1876, 4 months before I started my survey. He kept his hand on it for a moment before sliding it toward her. Read the second paragraph. She read it. Twice. The second paragraph of Silas Holt's letter to the Regional Acquisitions Director referenced in language that was careful, but not careful enough. A shared arrangement whereby survey information regarding homestead vulnerability would be made available to Holt's office prior to official filing in exchange for a percentage of proceeds from subsequent property acquisitions. It was not a confession. A good lawyer could argue it 6 different ways, but combined with the fee analysis she was building, combined with the transaction timeline, it was enough. You've been carrying this for 8 months, she said. Yes. Why didn't you take it to a judge yourself? He was quiet for long enough that she set down her pen and waited. Because I wrote those survey reports, he said. And I knew not everything but enough. I knew Holt was using the information. I told myself I didn't know how, that I couldn't prove anything, that it wasn't my job to investigate what happened after I filed. He looked at the table. I told myself those things for about 2 years before I couldn't anymore. What made you stop being able to? A woman in Chouteau County. I mentioned her before. Her name was Agnes Farrell. 61 years old, ran a sheep operation with her 2 grown sons. Holt took 42 acres of her best grazing land while her younger son was in the hospital in Great Falls. He paused. I had filed a report on her property 6 months before it happened. I described the water access, the grazing quality. I wrote that the operation appeared financially marginal. His jaw was tight. I might as well have written Holt a letter of invitation. Eleanor looked at him. She thought about what it cost a person to say something like that out loud to a stranger. She thought about the particular weight of a thing you had been carrying alone for a long time. You couldn't have known what he'd do with it, she said. I could have asked, Marsh said. I knew something was wrong and I didn't ask because asking would have made it my problem. He met her eyes. I've spent 8 months trying to make it my problem in retrospect. It's a poor substitute for doing it right the first time. She picked up the letter again. This is enough, she said. Between this and the fee analysis, this is enough to bring to a judge, but we need to move quickly. If Holt finds out you're here, he may already know. She set the letter down carefully. I stopped at the land office 2 days ago, Marsh said. I asked to look at property records. Standard request happens all the time. But the clerk, a young fellow nervous, he asked me twice what my interest was in Bitterroot Valley properties. That kind of twice is the kind that reports back to somebody. Eleanor thought about this. She thought about the distance from Clearwater to her property, which was 11 miles. She thought about a man with 11 miles between himself and a problem he wanted to resolve. "How long do we have?" she said. "I don't know. Days, maybe. A week if we're fortunate." She looked at the documents spread across the table. 7 charted, 2 remaining, and then the analysis to write, and then the letter to compose for the territorial judge in Helena, and then the matter of actually getting that letter to Helena and getting a response before Silas Holt showed up at her door with something worse than a friendly letter. "I need 3 days," she said. "All right. You'll stay." It wasn't a question. She was not entirely sure when it had stopped being a question in her mind. Somewhere between the fixed fee column and the letter in his shirt pocket, she had stopped calculating whether to trust him and started calculating how to use the trust efficiently. "I'll stay," he said. She pulled the 8th document toward her. "Then go back to sleep. I'll have the full analysis ready by morning, and we can talk through the letter to the judge after breakfast." He stood. He picked up his vest from the back of the chair. Then he paused. "Mrs. Cross." "Eleanor," she said without looking up. "If you're going to be here 3 days, Mrs. Cross is going to get tedious." A pause. "Eleanor." He said it carefully, like a man testing the weight of something. "When did you eat last?" She thought about the half biscuit at 4 in the morning. She did not answer. She heard him move to the shelf where she kept the food stores. She heard the sound of the bread box and the creak of the small cupboard. A few minutes later, he set a plate beside her documents without moving any of them. Bread and cold beans and 2 dried apricots. "Thank you," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He went back to the barn. She ate without stopping her work, which she suspected was exactly what he had calculated she would do. Ruth Blackwood arrived the next morning before the sun was fully up, which was Ruth's way of arriving everywhere. She came in her wagon with her gray hair pinned severely, and her expression set in the particular arrangement that meant she had heard something and driven 3 miles to find out if it was true. She pulled up to the cabin and looked at the bay horse in the lean-to, and then looked at Eleanor, who had come out to meet her. "Whose horse?" Ruth said. "His name is Marsh Calloway. He's helping me with the Holt situation." "Is he?" Ruth climbed down from the wagon with the ease of a woman who had been climbing in and out of wagons for 60 years. "Where is he now?" "Splitting wood, I think." Ruth looked in the direction of the woodpile, where the sound of an axe was steady and unhurried. She turned back to Eleanor. Her eyes went to Eleanor's belly, then to her face, reading both with the frank efficiency of a woman who had spent 3 years as a field nurse and did not believe in wasting time on delicacy. "You look terrible," Ruth said. "I worked through the night." "Did you eat?" "He made me eat." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "He made you." He left food on the table and went back to the barn. Something shifted in Ruth's expression, small and quickly contained. "Come inside," she said. "Tell me about this Holt situation." They sat at the table, and Eleanor walked her through it: the letter, the documents, the fee pattern, the letter Marsh had taken from the railroad files. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was not her natural inclination, and the fact that she held herself to it told Eleanor that she understood the seriousness. When Eleanor finished, Ruth looked at the columns of figures on the table for a long moment. "You've already written the analysis?" she said. "Most of it. I have the fee comparison done, and the timeline cross-referenced with the railroad survey dates. I still need to write the summary for the judge in language that isn't accounting language." "That's where you'll lose him," Ruth said. "Judges are lawyers. Lawyers don't like arithmetic." "I know. That's why I need the argument to be simple. 1 page, 3 points, plain language." Eleanor paused. "Marsh knows the railroad side of it better than I do. He can speak to the survey correlation." Ruth looked toward the window. The sound of the axe had stopped. A minute later, Marsh appeared at the door. She had left it open, it being a warm morning, and knocked on the frame. "Morning, ma'am," he said to Ruth, with the kind of courtesy that was habitual rather than performed. Ruth looked at him with the direct, unhurried assessment that had unnerved considerably larger men than Marsh Calloway. He stood it without flinching, which Eleanor noted, and which she suspected Ruth also noted. "You worked for the railroad," Ruth said. "Yes, ma'am." "And now you don't." "No, ma'am." "Why?" He told her the same thing he had told Eleanor in almost the same words without embellishment or mitigation. Ruth listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Agnes Farrell," she said. "I know that name. Her older son wrote a letter to the territorial governor's office about the land seizure. Never got a response." Something moved across Marsh's face. "No, it wouldn't have. Because someone in the governor's office is also in Holt's pocket," Eleanor said. "I don't know that for certain." He came the rest of the way into the room and sat down at the table, the three of them arranged around Eleanor's documents like a small council. "What I know is that the railroad's regional director, the man Holt wrote that letter to, has connections in the territorial government. That's why I didn't take this to Helena on my own. A man with no current employer, and a letter he technically took without permission, walking into a judge's chambers to accuse a respected banker, that's not a case. That's a story that gets buried. But an accounting analysis from a homesteader whose land is actively under threat," Eleanor said slowly. "That's a complaint. That's a party with standing. That's someone a judge has to hear," Marsh agreed. Ruth put her hands flat on the table. "So you need Eleanor's name on this as the complainant, with the accounting analysis as the evidence and your documents and your testimony as the corroboration." "Yes." "And you need it filed before Holt moves on her property." "Yes." Ruth looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked back at her. They had known each other for 2 years and had developed the kind of communication that lived mostly in silences. "I can take the documents to Helena," Ruth said. "I have a nephew there who practices law. He's not brilliant, but he's honest, and he knows which judges aren't connected to the railroad money." "How long to get there and back?" Eleanor said. 4 days if I push the horses. I need 2 days to finish the analysis and write the summary." Eleanor looked at Marsh. "Can you write out your testimony? What you saw, what you filed, the timeline of Holt's activity relative to your reports. Specific dates, specific properties. I can have it done by tomorrow evening." "Then Ruth leaves the morning after tomorrow." Eleanor sat back in her chair and pressed one hand against the persistent ache in her lower back. "That gives us 4 days before Holt would hear about the filing, assuming Ruth's nephew can get in front of a judge quickly. And 4 days to stay out of his way until we have a legal response in hand." Marsh looked at her. "You make it sound straightforward." "It isn't straightforward," Eleanor said. "But it's the correct sequence of steps, and standing here worrying about it won't improve on it." She paused. "What I need to know is whether Holt is likely to send someone out here before he hears from the court." "He'll send someone to check the property status. Standard pressure, nothing overtly threatening, just a reminder that he knows where you are and what your situation is." Marsh was matter-of-fact about it. "The question is whether he does that in 3 days or a week." "We work as if it's 3 days," Eleanor said. Ruth stood up. "I'll go home and pack a bag. I'll be back tomorrow evening." She looked at Marsh again. "You'll stay on the property." It was not a question. Marsh recognized that. "Yes, ma'am." Ruth picked up her shawl and walked to the door. She paused without turning around. "She worked herself to the bone alone for 14 months, she said, and her voice was flat and quiet in the way of someone making a statement of fact rather than an accusation. "She didn't ask for help once. Not from me, not from anyone." Marsh was quiet. "The fact that she let you in that door means something," Ruth said. "Don't make her regret it." She left. They listened to her wagon move off down the road. Eleanor looked at the documents on the table. She thought about what Ruth had said. She thought about how Ruth had looked at Marsh before she said it, not at Eleanor, at him, as if what she was saying was aimed at him and not meant to be overheard by Eleanor at all. She pulled the 9th document toward her. "She's right," she said without looking up. "I know," Marsh said. "I'm not telling you for sentiment. I'm telling you so you understand what's at stake if this doesn't work. I understand what's at stake. His voice was even. I understood it before I came through your fence. She picked up her pen. Outside, a hawk turned slow circles over the far end of the field. The creek ran steady somewhere in the distance, and the morning light was moving across the table the way it did this time of year, slow and golden, and absolutely indifferent to the documents spread beneath it. Eleanor Cross put her pen to paper and kept working. Ruth came back the next evening as promised with a packed bag and her nephew's address written on a folded card, and the particular expression of a woman who had made up her mind about something, and intended to keep it made up. She sat at the table with Eleanor and Marsh and went through the documents one final time, asking questions that were sharp and specific and occasionally made Marsh shift in his chair, which Eleanor suspected was Ruth's intention. Eleanor had finished the analysis that afternoon. 9 pages of clean, precise accounting laid out in plain language, the kind of language she had learned from watching her father explain complicated figures to clients who were smart people but not number people. She had written it the way her father wrote it. Short sentences. 1 idea per paragraph. The mathematics visible and simple enough that a person could follow the logic without needing to understand the methodology. Marsh had read it twice before dinner and not said a word for several minutes afterward. "This is good," he had finally said. "I know." She had said not from arrogance, but from the same flat certainty with which she said anything she had verified thoroughly. His testimony was 4 pages written in a hand that was plain and without flourish. The kind of handwriting that belonged to a man who had spent years writing field reports and knew that clear was more valuable than elegant. Eleanor had read it while he was outside and found 3 places where his memory of specific dates could be corroborated by the documents, and had made small notations in the margins with a question mark. When he came back in, she showed him the notations without comment. He looked at them and went back to the documents and corrected 2 of the 3 dates and confirmed the 3rd was right. That was how they had worked for 2 days, without ceremony, without the particular awkwardness that Eleanor had expected and that had not materialized, which she found both relieving and faintly disconcerting. Now Ruth tucked the documents into the leather satchel, refastened the buckle, and set it on the floor beside her chair with the finality of a woman completing a transaction. "My nephew's name is Caleb Marsh," she said, and paused when she saw the slight tightening around Marsh Calloway's eyes at the coincidence of the name. "He'll present this to Judge Alderman. Alderman's been on the territorial bench for 11 years, and he has a particular dislike of land fraud, which I know because he said so publicly at a town meeting in Helena 2 years ago, and Caleb was there." She looked at Eleanor. "It won't be fast." "How long?" "A week for the filing and the initial review. Maybe more before any action is ordered." Ruth looked at Marsh. "Can you keep this property secure for 2 weeks if it comes to that?" "I can." Eleanor looked at him sideways. He said it the way he said most things without inflation, without the slightly too firm quality that meant a man was promising more than he was certain of. She had started paying attention to the difference. Ruth stood, picked up the satchel, and looked at Eleanor with the expression that meant she was about to say something Eleanor might not like. "Sleep tonight," she said. "Not working sleep, actual sleep. Ruth, you're 8 days from your 8th month." Ruth's voice did not change in volume or tone, which was how Eleanor knew she was serious. "I have delivered enough babies on this frontier to know what happens when a woman wears herself down to nothing in the last weeks. You will not help yourself or that child by being too exhausted to function when you need to function most." She picked up her shawl. "The documents are done. There is nothing left to do tonight." She left before Eleanor could respond, which was also Ruth's way. The cabin was quiet after the wagon sound faded. Eleanor sat at the table and looked at the empty surface where the documents had been for 2 days. Marsh was by the window, not quite looking out, not quite looking at her. "She's right," he said. "Don't start." "I'm not starting anything. I'm agreeing with a correct observation." He turned from the window. "When did you last sleep more than 4 hours?" She thought about it honestly, and found she couldn't answer precisely which was itself an answer. "Go to sleep, Eleanor." He moved toward the door. "I'll check the horses, and then I'll be in the barn." "Marsh." He stopped. She had not planned to say anything else. She was not sure what she had intended when she said his name. She only knew that the cabin felt very large and very quiet, in a way it had not felt since James died, and that for 14 months she had told herself the largeness and the quiet were things she was accustomed to. She had been wrong about that. She was only now understanding she had been wrong about that. "Thank you," she said, "for the work, for staying." He looked at her for a moment. "Get some sleep," he said, not unkindly, and went out. She slept 7 hours. She woke at 5, feeling more rested than she had in months, and more unsettled than she could quite account for, and went about the morning with the determined practicality that was her primary defense against most things she didn't know how to address directly. Marsh was already up. She could hear him at the woodpile. The sound of it was becoming ordinary, in a way she was trying not to examine. She made coffee and stood in the doorway with her cup and watched the morning and thought about the documents on their way to Helena, and about Silas Holt, and about the 2 weeks of waiting that stretched between here and whatever the judge decided. 2 weeks was a long time on 40 acres, with a man she had known for 3 days. "Morning," Marsh said, coming around the corner of the cabin with an armload of wood. "Morning." She held out the second cup, which she had poured without quite deciding to. He took it with the ease of someone who had stopped being surprised by small gestures. They stood in the early light and drank their coffee. "He'll send someone today or tomorrow," Marsh said, "now that Ruth is gone." Eleanor had been thinking the same thing. "What do we do when he does?" "You let me handle the conversation." She looked at him. "I don't mean you step back from your own property," he said, reading her expression accurately. "I mean that whoever Holt sends will be looking to take the measure of the situation. They'll want to know if you have support, if you're going to put up a legal fight, how much trouble you're going to be." He paused. "A woman alone is a certain kind of problem for them. A woman with a man on the property who's already looking at them like he knows exactly what they're doing is a different kind of problem. You want to be a deterrent. I want to be a deterrent, yes. And I want to hear whatever they say because what Holt tells his people tells me where he thinks he is in this." Eleanor considered it. She did not like the architecture of it, the idea that a man's presence on her property carried a weight that her own presence didn't. It was true, and she knew it was true, and she disliked both the truth and the knowledge with equal measure. "All right," she said. He nodded. They had gotten through breakfast and the morning chores, and Eleanor was at the table updating her payment ledger. Keeping the records current felt important. A statement of occupancy made in ink when they heard the horse on the road. One horse. Marsh was outside already. She heard him stop moving. She set down her pen and put her hand briefly on the small pistol in her apron pocket. Then she stood up and went to the door. The man on the road was not anyone she recognized. He was perhaps 40, with a soft look about him that didn't match the quality of his horse or the cut of his coat. He had the deliberate pleasantness of someone who had been told to be pleasant and was following instructions. "Good morning." He addressed himself to Marsh, who was standing at the fence. "I'm looking for the Cross property." "You found it," Marsh said. "I'm looking for Mrs. Cross specifically. I have a message from Mr. Silas Holt's office." "I'm Mrs. Cross," Eleanor said from the doorway. The man looked at her, then at her belly, then at Marsh, conducting a quick calculation that she could see him performing. "Ma'am, my name is Fowler. I work for Mr. Holt." He produced an envelope. "Mr. Holt wanted to follow up on the letter he sent recently. He's concerned that he hasn't had a response and wanted to make sure you received it." "I received it," Eleanor said. "Well?" Fowler maintained his pleasant expression with the visible effort of a man carrying something heavy. "Mr. Holt wanted me to convey that he's prepared to be very reasonable in discussing the terms, given your situation." His eyes moved to her belly again. "My situation," Eleanor said. "A woman alone expecting a child, managing a property on her own." Fowler's tone was gentle in a way that made her back teeth press together. "Mr. Holt has helped a number of families in similar circumstances. He's a patient man, But the matter of the outstanding balance on your note does need to be resolved before—" "There's no outstanding balance," Eleanor said. Fowler blinked. "Ma'am, according to Mr. Holt's records—" "I know what Mr. Holt's records say." She came down the porch steps, moving deliberately. Marsh had not moved from the fence. "I also know what my records say. I have every payment receipt from the past 3 years dated and witnessed, and the total paid exceeds the original loan amount by $14.60, which means the note is retired and there is no balance." She stopped at the bottom of the steps. "You tell Mr. Holt that I know about the transfer fee. Tell him I know exactly how he calculated it and how he applied it, and tell him that I have put that information in front of people who understand what it means." Fowler's pleasant expression did not disappear, but it changed in some fundamental way, like a light behind a window being adjusted. He looked at Marsh. Marsh looked back at him without expression. "Mrs. Cross," Fowler said, and his voice had lost some of its gentleness, "I'd encourage you to think carefully. Mr. Holt is a patient man, but he's also a thorough one. A woman in your position, without legal representation, without—" "I have representation," Eleanor said. "You can tell Mr. Holt that as well." She watched Fowler process this. She watched him look at Marsh again. She watched him make the decision that whatever he'd been sent to accomplish today was not going to be accomplished today. "I'll pass along your response," he said. He gathered his reins. "Good day, ma'am, sir." He rode back down the road. They watched him until the sound of the horse faded. Marsh turned from the fence. His expression had not changed significantly, but there was something behind his eyes that had been there since Fowler mentioned Holt's name and had not settled. "That was faster than I expected," he said. "He was watching the property." Eleanor turned back toward the cabin. "He was already watching it before Ruth left, which means he saw her go." She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "He's going to move on this sooner than we thought." "Yes." Marsh followed her to the steps. "Eleanor, when you said you had representation—" "I need that to be true," she said. He was quiet. She turned and looked at him directly. "I can do the accounting work. I've done it. But if Holt sends a lawyer out here with paperwork before we hear from Helena, I need someone who can speak to the legal status of the documents. Who can say with authority what the railroad survey records show?" She paused. "You know that material better than anyone alive. You were there. You filed those reports." "I'm not a lawyer." "I know you're not a lawyer. I'm not asking you to be a lawyer. I'm asking you to be a man who has primary knowledge of the relevant documents and who is willing to state that knowledge clearly in front of whoever Holt sends." She held his eyes. "Are you willing to do that?" He held her eyes back. "Yes." "Then you're my representation." Something shifted in the lines around his eyes. Not quite a smile. She was coming to understand that Marsh Calloway did not smile. The way most people smiled, the expression started somewhere deeper and only reached his face partially, like a thing being offered rather than performed. "Yes, ma'am," he said. They went back inside, and Eleanor sat down at the table and opened her ledger and wrote the date and Fowler's visit in her running record of events, because documentation was documentation, and she intended to have a complete contemporaneous account of every interaction from the moment Holt's letter arrived. "The transfer fee," Marsh said, sitting across from her. "You told him you knew how he calculated it. You did that on purpose." "I wanted him to go back and tell Holt exactly that. Not that I suspected a problem, that I understood the mechanism." "Why?" "Because a man like Holt has spent 3 years moving on properties where the owners didn't know what was wrong, only that something was. He's accustomed to that kind of opponent." She looked up from the ledger. "I want him to understand he's dealing with someone different this time. I want him to hesitate." Marsh looked at her steadily. "You want him to come at you directly?" "I want him to make a mistake because he's uncertain." She paused. "Precise men who get greedy make mistakes when they're uncertain. I told you that." He was quiet for a moment. What if he decides not to hesitate? What if he just acts? She set down her pen.
She thought about this with the same flat clarity she tried to bring to everything. "Then we deal with what he does," she said. "But I won't spend 2 weeks in a crouch waiting for him to determine the pace of this. That's his preference, and I won't give it to him." Marsh looked at her for a long moment. She was accustomed by now to the quality of his attention, the way he listened without filling the silence, the way he looked at her as though she were a thing that warranted being seen accurately. "Your husband," he said. "Did he understand what he had?" The question was not what she expected. She looked at her ledger. "James was a good man," she said. "He wasn't a practical one. He saw the land and the possibility, and he believed in both with everything he had." She smoothed a corner of the ledger page. "He didn't understand numbers the way I do. He didn't see the world in patterns the way I do." She paused. "He valued what I was. I know he did. But he didn't always know how to make use of it, I suppose. He thought of it as something I did in the evenings, not something that was central to what we were trying to build." She said it without bitterness, because it was true without bitterness. James had loved her. Love and clear-eyed recognition were not always the same thing. "He should have put you in front of every financial decision the property faced," Marsh said. Not gently, just plainly as a statement of observed fact. Eleanor looked at him. "I'm not criticizing a dead man," he said. "I'm saying what I can see from the outside, which is that you have a mind that is wasted on the secondary position in anything." He met her eyes without apology. "That's not sentiment. That's just accurate." She did not have an immediate response to this. She had received compliments. She had received appreciation. She had not before this moment received what felt like a simple professional assessment delivered by someone with no stake in making her feel good about herself. The baby moved, a decisive rolling movement that pressed against her ribs with enough force that she caught her breath. Marsh was on his feet before she registered that he had moved. "Are you all right?" "Fine." She put her hand on her side. "She does this when I've been sitting too long, or when she's decided she wants my attention." She breathed through it the way she had learned to do. "She's been doing it since June." Marsh stood half out of his chair with the particular helplessness of someone who wants to do something useful and cannot identify what it is. "Sit down," she said not unkindly. "There's nothing to be done. She'll settle in a minute." He sat down slowly. His eyes stayed on her face, with a focus that she recognized because she had seen it before, when something mattered to him more than he was ready to say out loud. "You keep saying she," he said. "I don't know. It's just a feeling." The movement stilled, and she let out a slow breath. James wanted a boy. He talked about it the way he talked about most things with complete confidence, that it would be exactly what he wanted, because he couldn't quite imagine the world not arranging itself according to his expectations. She smiled despite herself. He wasn't wrong often enough to have learned proper uncertainty. "And what do you want?" She thought about it, which was something she had not let herself do much. Wanting felt like dangerous territory when so much was uncertain. "I want her to have more choices than I did," she said. "I want her to grow up knowing that her mind is worth something, that the work she does with her head is as real as the work she does with her hands." She stopped. "I want her to know that she doesn't have to wait for someone to give her permission to be the most capable person in the room." Marsh was quiet for a moment. "She'll know that," he said. "She'll know it because she'll watch her mother." Eleanor looked at him. She did not look away, and neither did he. And the silence between them was a different kind of silence than the silences they had been living in for 3 days. Something had shifted inside. It became something that required more care in how it was handled. She picked up her pen. "We need to talk about what happens if Holt sends more than one man next time," she said. Marsh pulled his chair slightly forward. "Tell me what you're thinking." She opened to a fresh page in the ledger. Outside, the afternoon wind had come up, and the grass moved in long silver waves across the field,
and the creek ran steady in the distance, indifferent as ever. Eleanor Cross pressed her pen to the page and began to plan, and Marsh Calloway leaned in to listen, and neither of them said anything more about the silence that had opened and closed between them, like a door neither was quite ready to walk through yet. 3 days after Fowler's visit, Holt sent a lawyer. Eleanor heard the horses before she saw them too this time, which she had anticipated. She was at the table, working through the property tax records she had pulled from the chest under the bed, building a secondary layer of documentation that established continuous occupancy and improvement of the land across 3 years. Marsh was outside replacing a broken fence post on the south side of the property. She heard him stop working. She did not get up immediately. She finished the line she was writing, set the pen down at a precise angle across the top of the page, and stood. By the time she reached the door, Marsh was already at the fence line. The 2 men on horseback had stopped at the road. One of them she recognized as Fowler, subdued and careful in his posture the way a man was subdued when his first errand had gone badly. The other was older, with a leather case across his saddle, and the particular bearing of someone accustomed to having rooms fall quiet when he entered them. "Mrs. Cross." The older man addressed her directly, which she noted as distinct from Fowler's behavior. "My name is Gerald Whitmore. I represent Silas Holt's financial interests in Clearwater County. I'd like a few minutes of your time." "You can have them," Eleanor said. "Step down if you like." Whitmore stepped down. Fowler stayed on his horse, which told Eleanor something about the respective nature of their assignments today. Marsh came to stand beside Eleanor at the foot of the porch steps. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Whitmore looked at him with the assessing eye of a man who made his living reading rooms. "And you are Marsh Calloway. I'm advising Mrs. Cross on this matter." "In what capacity?" "In the capacity of someone with direct knowledge of the railroad survey records that Holt's office has been using as the basis for its acquisition activity in this valley." Marsh said it without heat, without emphasis. Just words in order. "If you'd like to discuss the specifics, I'm prepared to do that." Something moved behind Whitmore's eyes. He recovered quickly and turned back to Eleanor. "Mrs. Cross, my client is a reasonable man who wants to resolve this matter without conflict. He's prepared to offer you a settlement, a fair price for the property, enough to allow you to relocate somewhere more suited to your current circumstances." "No," Eleanor said. Whitmore paused. "Perhaps you should hear the figure before—" "Mr. Whitmore, the figure is not relevant." Eleanor kept her voice level and her eyes on his. "This land is not for sale. My note is paid in full. The lien your client is asserting is based on a transfer fee calculation that was applied incorrectly and consistently across multiple properties in a pattern that is not consistent with clerical error." She paused one beat. "I have documented that pattern in detail, and it is currently in front of Judge Alderman in Helena." Whitmore went still. It was the stillness of a man recalculating. Eleanor watched it happen behind his face, the reassessment, the reconsideration of what he had walked into versus what he had been told he was walking into. "Judge Alderman," he said, and the name came out slightly too carefully. "My documentation was filed 4 days ago," Eleanor said. The filing references 9 transactions in 3 counties with a cross-referenced timeline establishing the correlation between Mr. Holt's acquisition activity and the railroad survey reports. She did not look at Marsh, but she felt him shift slightly beside her, a small movement of acknowledgement. If your client wants to discuss settlement, he can discuss it with the judge. Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. He was a lawyer, and lawyers did not show their hands readily. But there was something working in his expression that looked very much like a man who had been sent out on an errand without being given the full truth of the situation he was walking into. "I see," he said finally. "I imagine you do," Eleanor said. Whitmore picked up his reins. He looked at Marsh once more with the expression of a man filing information away for later. "Mr. Calloway, the railroad company may have an interest in the records you mentioned." The railroad company is welcome to make that case to Judge Alderman, Marsh said, along with everything else. Whitmore mounted his horse. He and Fowler rode back down the road without further conversation. Eleanor watched them go. She was aware that her hands were entirely steady, which she was grateful for because the rest of her was not entirely steady. The baby was pressing hard against her right side, and her back had developed the deep grinding ache that came on when she stood too long and she had slept poorly the night before, because she had been running calculations in her head, even in the dark with her eyes closed. She turned and went back up the porch steps. Marsh followed her inside. She sat down at the table, and he pulled out the chair across from her, but did not sit standing with his hand on the back of it looking at her. He didn't know about Helena, he said. No, Holt didn't tell his own lawyer. She picked up her pen, which means either Holt doesn't believe the filing is real yet, or he doesn't fully trust Whitmore. Or he thought sending the lawyer would be enough to settle it, and didn't want Whitmore knowing the details. Marsh sat down. If Whitmore knew the full scope of what Holt's been doing, he'd be looking at disbarment for knowingly assisting a fraud. Which means Whitmore may now be a problem for Holt rather than a resource. Eleanor looked at the tax records in front of her. A lawyer who realizes he's been used as a tool in something criminal has very limited options. He either becomes complicit or he distances himself. You think he'll distance himself? I think he's a man who spent a career protecting his reputation, and Holt just put that reputation at risk without warning him. She paused. I wouldn't want to be in Holt's office when Whitmore gets back. Marsh was quiet for a moment, then carefully. That was well done. Out there. She looked up from the records. I mean it, he said. You didn't give him an inch of ground to stand on, and you did it without raising your voice. Raising my voice would have made it about anger, she said. I didn't want it to be about anger. I wanted it to be about facts. It was about facts. Yes. She looked back at the records. James used to tell me I was too controlled, that I didn't let myself feel things properly. She smoothed the edge of the paper with her thumb. He wasn't wrong exactly, but out there, talking to Whitmore being controlled was the right tool for the situation. It was the right tool, Marsh agreed. Doesn't mean James was wrong about the other thing. She looked at him. He met her eyes without flinching. A person can be capable of two things at once. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at her work. We need to think about what Holt does next, she said. He can't send Whitmore back, not after this. He can try to block the filing in Helena, but that would require him to have the kind of influence with Judge Alderman that Ruth's nephew says he doesn't have. She tapped the pen against the page. What does a man do when his legal options close and his timeline is running out? He gets less careful, Marsh said. His voice was flat, and the flatness had an undertone she recognized now as the particular evenness he used when something concerned him more than he was showing. Tell me what less careful looks like. It looks like someone showing up here who isn't a lawyer. Someone whose job isn't to negotiate. He paused. Holt has used physical intimidation before. I didn't include it in the testimony because I couldn't document it directly, but the Farrell family in Chouteau County, Agnes Farrell's younger son, the one in the hospital. He went there because someone burned a section of their fencing, and he went after the man he saw doing it. Eleanor was quiet. I'm not telling you this to frighten you, Marsh said. I'm telling you because you're the kind of person who makes better decisions with complete information. I know. She was thinking. He won't move on the property directly while the filing is in front of a judge. That's too visible, too documentable. No. But he might try to create a reason the filing should be dismissed, discredit the evidence, discredit the people who filed it. He looked at her directly. Discredit me. My history with the railroad company, my reasons for leaving those things, can be made to look like I have a vendetta. A disgruntled former employee making accusations against his employer's business partner. Eleanor had thought about this. She had thought about it the night she couldn't sleep, lying in the dark, listening to the creak, and running through every angle of vulnerability she could identify. "Your testimony is corroborating evidence," she said. "The primary evidence is my accounting analysis. My name is on the complaint. My records establish the fraud as it applies specifically to my property. And they'll come after your credibility too. A pregnant widow who kept careful books and paid her note on time. She said it without self-pity, just assessment. They can try. Eleanor." He leaned forward slightly, forearms on the table. "I want you to go to Ruth's for a while." She looked at him. "Not permanently, not in retreat, just while we're in the most exposed period before the judge responds." His eyes were steady. "You'd be harder to pressure at Ruth's. She's 3 miles out and she's known in the area. Anything that happened to you there would have witnesses. And this property sits empty. I'd be here. You'd be here alone." She shook her head. "Marsh, if I leave this land, I hand Holt a narrative. A woman who abandoned her homestead under pressure. That narrative has legal uses." He was quiet. "I know what you're trying to do," she said more gently, "and I understand it, but I am not leaving my land." He sat back. The muscle in his jaw moved once. "All right." "I won't do anything unnecessary," she said. "I'll stay inside when I don't need to be out. I won't go to town." She paused. "And I'll tell you if I feel unsafe. I will actually tell you, Marsh. I won't try to manage it alone." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's a significant concession from you. Don't make it into more than it is." "I'm not." His voice was quiet. "I'm just noting it." They sat with that for a moment, the afternoon light moving across the table between them. It was 2 days later that everything shifted. Ruth came back. Not in 4 days as expected, not in the steady, measured way Ruth did most things, but fast, her wagon moving at a pace that brought Eleanor to the door before she had consciously decided to stand up. Marsh was beside her by the time Ruth pulled the horses to a stop. Ruth climbed down, and her face told Eleanor what kind of news she was carrying before she said a word. "Not bad news. Something else. Something that required speed. Caleb got in front of Alderman yesterday morning," Ruth said, coming up the steps without preamble. "Alderman read the analysis the same day." Eleanor's hand tightened on the doorframe. "He's issuing a temporary injunction on any property transfer or lien enforcement activity related to the accounts named in the filing," Ruth said. "That covers your property. It also covers 4 other properties in the valley that Caleb identified from your documentation as being in Holt's active acquisition pipeline." Marsh exhaled, a short controlled sound. "There's more," Ruth said, and she was looking at Eleanor with an expression Eleanor had never seen on her before, something that was almost wonder, coming from a woman who had very little patience for wonder as a general practice. "Alderman sent a letter to the Territorial Attorney General yesterday afternoon. Caleb said Alderman told him that the accounting analysis he submitted was the clearest documentation of systematic land fraud he had seen in 11 years on the bench." Eleanor sat down on the porch step. She did not plan to. Her legs made the decision independently. "He said that," she said. "Caleb wrote it down because he knew I'd ask him to repeat it, and he didn't want to get it wrong." Ruth produced a folded note from her coat pocket and held it out. "He quoted it directly." Eleanor took the note. She read it. She read it again. The clearest documentation of systematic land fraud he had seen in 11 years on the bench. She folded the note along its original creases and held it in both hands and looked at the road. "The injunction stops him," Marsh said. He was standing at the top of the steps, and she could hear in his voice the thing that had been underneath all of it from the beginning. The long-held weight of Agnes Farrell, and 4 years of filed reports, and 8 months of carrying documents alone through cold country, waiting for someone who could do what he couldn't do by himself. He can't move on any of those properties while it's in place. "It's not permanent," Ruth said. "Alderman will need to hold a formal hearing. Holt will have the opportunity to respond." She looked at Eleanor. "But Caleb says the weight of it is against Holt." The pattern is too clear and too well documented to be explained away. Eleanor stood up. She handed the note back to Ruth. She was quiet for a moment, organizing herself. "When is the hearing?" she said. 6 weeks. Then we have 6 weeks to ensure our documentation is complete. Every payment record, every piece of correspondence, every entry in my running account of events. She turned to Marsh. "And your testimony needs to be formalized, sworn and witnessed." "Caleb can arrange that," Ruth said. "He wants to meet with you both before the hearing. He says he'll come here if you'd prefer not to travel." "Tell him to come here," Marsh said. He looked at Eleanor. "She shouldn't travel right now." Eleanor looked at him sideways. She was 8 months along, and she was aware of it in every particular, and she had spent 2 weeks determinedly not letting it slow her down. But there was something in the way he said it, not overprotective, not making her smaller, just factual and careful and oriented toward her well-being, without apology, that she let sit without argument. "Tell him to come here," she agreed. Ruth looked between them with the expression of a woman who was cataloging something she intended to return to at a later time. She stayed for coffee and went through the details of the hearing with them for an hour, methodical and thorough in the way she did everything, and then she stood to leave. At the door she paused and turned back. She did this often enough that Eleanor had learned to wait. "Alderman's clerk asked Caleb who prepared the accounting analysis," Ruth said. Caleb told him. The clerk said the judge asked to have the preparer's name noted on the official file. She looked at Eleanor. "Your name is in the record, Eleanor, in the judge's own notes." Eleanor did not have anything to say to this. It landed somewhere below words. Ruth left. The sound of her wagon faded, and the cabin was quiet again. Marsh stood by the window. Eleanor sat at the table with her hands flat on the surface in front of her. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks. He turned from the window. "Eleanor." She looked up. He crossed to the table and sat down. He was looking at her with the direct, uncomplicated attention she had come to recognize as his particular way of seeing the world. No angle, no flattery, no management of her response. "I have been carrying what I knew about Holt for 8 months, he said. "I went to 4 different people. 2 of them didn't understand the documents. 1 understood them and was afraid. 1 understood them and told me there was nothing he could do without a complainant withstanding." He paused. "I had almost decided that I was going to have to find a way to do it that didn't require someone else to carry the risk. And then you rode past the land office and saw my name," she said. "And then I rode past the land office and saw your name." He held her eyes. "I want you to understand something. The reason this worked, the reason Alderman called it the clearest documentation he'd seen in 11 years, is not because of what I had. What I had was a collection of pieces. What you did was build something out of them. Something that holds together and makes sense and cannot be argued away." He stopped. "That was you, the 9 pages. The fixed fee analysis. The language plain enough that a judge could follow it without a calculator. That was you." Eleanor looked at him. "You asked me the first day what I wanted in return," he said. "I told you I wanted to put Holt in front of a judge. That's still true, but I want you to know that what I have watched you do in the past 2 weeks." He stopped again. "Marsh." Her voice was quiet. "I have never met anyone like you," he said. It came out plainly without drama the way he said everything that mattered to him. "I want you to know that." The afternoon light was long and gold on the table between them. The baby pressed steady against her ribs. Outside, the grass moved in the wind and the creek ran on, and Eleanor Cross sat in the home she had kept by herself for 14 months and looked at the man across from her and felt something in her chest shift in a way that had nothing to do with calculation. "I know," she said, softly. "I think I know." He nodded. He did not push further. He was that kind of man. She pulled her ledger toward her and opened it to a fresh page. "Help me draft the outline for Caleb's visit," she said. He pulled his chair closer to the table. They worked until the light failed, and neither of them spoke about the door that had opened quietly between them in the long afternoon, but both of them knew it was there, and both of them left it standing open. Caleb Marsh arrived on a Tuesday 3 weeks before the hearing, riding a good horse and carrying a briefcase that looked newer than the rest of him. He was Ruth's nephew, in the way that some people were related to formidable women, grateful for it and slightly afraid of it in equal measure. He was perhaps 35 with an earnest quality about him that Eleanor initially read as inexperience until she watched him go through the documents for an hour and revised her assessment entirely. He was not inexperienced. He was simply a man who had not yet learned to hide that he cared about his work. He sat at Eleanor's table for 4 hours. He asked questions that were precise and occasionally unexpected, the kind that revealed he had read everything she sent and thought about it carefully, rather than using the meeting as his first engagement with the material. He asked Marsh to walk him through the survey timeline twice, stopping him at specific points to clarify dates. He asked Eleanor about the original loan negotiation, who was present, who witnessed the signing, whether she had retained the envelope the original documents arrived in. She had retained the envelope. She had retained everything. Caleb looked at the envelope and then at her with an expression she recognized as the look of someone who had learned not to expect good record-keeping and kept being surprised by it. "The postmark confirms the date the loan documents were originally sent," he said, "which means we can establish the baseline document was unaltered at the point of delivery because the terms Holt is now asserting don't match the terms in the original mailing." "That's what I calculated," Eleanor said. "Yes." He set the envelope down carefully. "Mrs. Cross, I want to be direct with you about the hearing. Holt will have representation. His lawyer will be better than Whitmore. Whitmore has already withdrawn from the matter, which tells us something about how Whitmore reads the situation. Whoever Holt brings in will attempt to characterize your analysis as the work of a layperson with a personal interest in the outcome." "I am a layperson with a personal interest in the outcome," Eleanor said. "You are. But the analysis itself doesn't have a personal interest. Numbers don't." Caleb looked at her steadily. "What I need from you at the hearing is exactly what you did in these 9 pages. Plain language, sequential logic, no emotion. You let the arithmetic make the argument." "That's how I always make arguments," she said. Marsh, sitting at the end of the table, made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. Caleb looked between them. "Is there anything else I need to know about the situation here before the hearing? Anything that's happened since the injunction was issued?" "Holt hasn't contacted me directly since Whitmore's visit," Eleanor said. "Nothing on the property has been disturbed. Ruth's been out twice, and she hasn't seen any unusual activity on the road." "The quiet worries me more than the noise would," Marsh said. Caleb nodded. "Me too." He closed his briefcase. "The Attorney General's office has opened a preliminary inquiry based on Alderman's referral. That's not public yet, but it means Holt knows he's being looked at from 2 directions simultaneously. A man in that position is either preparing to fight very hard or preparing to run, and I can't yet determine which." "He won't run," Eleanor said. "He has too much tied up in this valley. The railway spur alone is worth more than everything else he's accumulated." She paused. "He'll fight, and he'll try to find a way to discredit the filing before the hearing. Which is why you don't leave this property alone between now and then," Caleb said, looking at Marsh. "Understood," Marsh said. Caleb left before supper with copies of additional documents and Eleanor's sworn statement added to the file. She stood on the porch and watched his horse move down the road and felt the weight of 3 weeks of waiting settle over her like a second skin. The baby was very low now. Ruth had told her that 2 days ago, pressing careful hands against Eleanor's belly with the practiced certainty of a woman who had done this many times. Low and settled and ready, Ruth had said, which could mean 2 weeks or could mean less. Eleanor had noted this the way she noted all data points with precision and without panic, and had gone back to her records. That night, she could not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the creak and thought about the hearing, and thought about the 9 pages, and thought about Marsh asleep in the barn 20 feet from her door, which was a thought she had been managing carefully for 2 weeks with decreasing success. She got up. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and went to the table and lit the lamp on its lowest setting and opened the ledger. She had a habit of reviewing her entries when she couldn't sleep, not adding to them, just reading, making sure the record was complete. It steadied her in the same way that the plow had steadied her, the physical act of moving through something in order. She heard him at the door before he knocked. She had started to hear him that way, the particular quality of his footstep, the way he moved with a carefulness that was habitual and not performed. "Come in," she said. He came in. He looked at her and then at the lamp and made his own assessment of the situation, which was that she was not sleeping and had not been sleeping and was not going to start in the immediate future. He sat down across from her without asking. He did not ask if she was all right, which she appreciated because she was not entirely all right, and they both knew it, and the question would have required her to either lie or explain something she did not have clean language for yet. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. She looked at the ledger. "I'm thinking about what happens after the hearing." She paused. "I've been so focused on the hearing itself that I haven't allowed myself to think past it. But it's 3 weeks away, and I need to think past it. What happens after the hearing is that Holt's liens are voided, and you keep your land," Marsh said. "And the Attorney General's inquiry proceeds, and Holt faces consequences that go beyond your property. That's the outcome I'm working toward." She turned a page in the ledger. "But outcomes and plans are different things. After the hearing, Caleb goes back to Helena. Ruth goes back to her own farm. The Attorney General's inquiry takes months." She looked at the lamp. "And I have a baby who may arrive before the hearing or may not. And either way, I am going to be, for a period of time, significantly less capable of defending this property than I am right now." Marsh was quiet. "I am not asking you to stay," she said. Carefully. "I want to be clear about that. You came here to do a specific thing, and you have done it, and the rest is—" She stopped. "Eleanor." His voice was low and even. "Look at me." She looked at him. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Marsh." "I'm not going anywhere." He said it the second time with the same flatness he used for established facts. "That's not me making a declaration. That's me telling you what is true so that you can plan accordingly." He paused. "I know you're not asking me to stay. You wouldn't ask. That's not how you're built. But I'm telling you anyway because you need the information." She looked at him for a long moment. In the low lamplight, she could see the lines of his face clearly, the weathering around his eyes, the set of his jaw, the particular stillness of a man who had made a decision and was at peace with it. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer, or might answer in the oblique way of someone who was not ready to be fully direct. But Marsh Calloway was, she had learned, a man who believed in the value of plain speech, even when it cost him something. "Because I drove through 4 counties for 8 months looking for someone who could do what needed to be done," he said. "And the someone turned out to be a woman on her own 40 acres who read a fraudulent title document in 30 seconds and has spent 2 weeks building the most careful legal case I have ever seen out of sheer force of intelligence and refusal to be beaten." He looked at her steadily. "And somewhere in those 2 weeks I stopped thinking about the case and started thinking about the person making it." Eleanor did not look away. "That's honest. I find it's the most efficient approach." She almost smiled. The baby moved low and heavy, and she put her hand on her side. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "What you're describing. I did it once. I learned it with James over 3 years, and it was good and real, and then it was gone." She looked at the lamp. "I don't know if I have the architecture for it again." "You don't have to do anything tonight," Marsh said. "Or before the hearing. Or at any particular speed." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm not asking you to decide something. I'm asking you to know that I'm here, and that I intend to keep being here, and that you can include that in your planning." "You're asking me to update my ledger," she said. "Yes." The thing that was almost a smile moved behind his eyes. "Exactly that." She looked at him for another moment. Then she reached across the table and turned the lamp up slightly. "Help me review the final documentation for Caleb," she said. "I want everything in order before the baby comes." He pulled his chair around to her side of the table. They worked until 2 in the morning. The baby came 9 days later, 1 week before the hearing, in the early hours of a cold Montana morning that had turned sharp and clear overnight. Eleanor woke at 3 to a pain that was different from all the previous pains in its purposefulness, and she lay still for 10 minutes confirming the pattern before she got up. She lit the lamp. She put the kettle on. She went to the door and called his name once, not loudly, because she did not want to frighten him with urgency before urgency was necessary. He was inside in under a minute. He took one look at her face and went for his horse without being told. Ruth arrived 40 minutes later. Marsh had ridden for her in the dark at a pace that Ruth, arriving with her hair only half-pinned and her coat buttoned, incorrectly confirmed, had been considerable. He came back and stood outside the door as Ruth had instructed him, and he stayed there the entire time, which was 7 hours, which Eleanor knew because she asked Ruth twice what time it was and calculated the interval. The baby was born just after 10 in the morning. A girl as Eleanor had believed she would be. She was small and complete and announced herself with the absolute conviction of someone who had been waiting to make a point. Ruth placed her in Eleanor's arms, and Eleanor looked at her daughter's face, eyes squeezed tight, mouth open, furious and perfect, and felt something unlock in her chest that she had not known was locked. "She's healthy," Ruth said, in the voice she used when she was confirming something that had worried her and could now be released. "Good color, strong." "Yes," Eleanor said. She could not say more than that. Ruth went to the door and spoke to Marsh in a low voice. A minute later, he came to the doorway, not inside, standing at the threshold with his hat in his hand. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at the baby. His expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. "Come in," Eleanor said. He came to the side of the bed and looked down at her daughter with the same careful attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. The baby had stopped crying and was making the small, searching movements of a very new person trying to understand the world. "She looks like you," he said. "She looks like herself," Eleanor said. "She's about 12 minutes old. Give her time." He reached out one finger slowly, and the baby's hand closed around it with the powerful, involuntary grip of the newborn. He went very still. "What's her name?" he said quietly. Eleanor had thought about this. She had thought about it the way she thought about everything, turning it carefully, looking at it from multiple angles. "Clara," she said. "Clara James Cross." She paused. James was her father's name. She should have it. Marsh looked at her. "Clara," he said. "That's a good name." "It is," Eleanor agreed. Ruth busied herself at the other end of the room with the particular tact of a woman who understood when she was not the relevant person in a moment. Eleanor looked at Marsh standing at the side of her bed with her daughter's hand around his finger and felt the thing she had been refusing to name settle into her with the quiet certainty of something that had been true for a while and was only now being acknowledged. "You said you weren't going anywhere," she said. "I'm not," he said. "Then you should know." She stopped, organized herself. "You should know that I have revised my position on what I'm willing to plan for." She looked at him directly. "I am not good at half measures. If you stay, I need you to understand that." "I understand that," he said. "And I need you to understand that I will always be the one who keeps the books." Something broke open in his face. Then fully, completely, the thing behind his eyes that she had been watching try to surface for 2 weeks. It was not a small smile. It was the real thing. "Eleanor Cross," he said. "I would not have it any other way." Clara made a sound of profound opinion, and they both looked at her. And the sound of it, that small voice in the quiet cabin, was the most clarifying thing Eleanor had heard in 14 months. The hearing was held 1 week later. Eleanor rode to Clearwater in Ruth's wagon, Clara in her arms, Marsh on horseback alongside them. Caleb met them at the courthouse steps with his briefcase and his earnest face and the particular expression of a lawyer who had done his preparation and knew it. Holt's new representation was a man named Price from Billings, polished and aggressive, who attempted in his opening remarks to characterize Eleanor's accounting analysis as the motivated work of a debtor seeking to avoid legitimate obligation. Alderman let him finish. Then the judge asked Eleanor to walk him through the fixed fee analysis. She did it in 12 minutes, in the plain sequential language she had used in the 9 pages, without emotion, without embellishment, letting the numbers stand for themselves. Price objected twice. Alderman overruled him both times. Marsh testified for 40 minutes about the survey records and the timeline of Holt's acquisition activity. He was calm and specific and answered Price's cross-examination with the same flat precision he brought to everything. At one point, Price attempted to characterize him as a disgruntled former employee manufacturing accusations. Marsh looked at the lawyer and said, without raising his voice, that the documents spoke for themselves, and the court was welcome to examine every original against his copies and find any discrepancy. Price moved on. Alderman delivered his ruling from the bench at 4 p.m. The liens were voided. The transfer fees were declared fraudulent. The matter was referred in full to the Territorial Attorney General with a recommendation for criminal proceedings. Holt, sitting at the defendant's table in his careful suit, did not move his expression, but his hands resting on the table had gone white at the knuckles. Eleanor sat in the courtroom with Clara asleep against her shoulder and heard Alderman's words and felt the floor of something solid come up under her feet. Not relief exactly. Completion. The particular feeling of a calculation that had been running for months, finally resolving to its correct answer. Outside on the courthouse steps, Caleb shook her hand and then Marsh's hand and told them the Attorney General's office had already been in contact and the inquiry into Holt's other acquisitions was active and moving. Ruth put her arm around Eleanor's shoulder briefly, which was Ruth's version of an embrace. Marsh stood on the bottom step. The late afternoon light was sharp and clean, and the mountains in the distance were beginning to show the first suggestion of autumn. He looked at Eleanor. "Ready to go home," he said. She looked at him. She looked at Clara, who had woken and was considering the world with the dark-eyed gravity of someone conducting a preliminary assessment. "Yes," Eleanor said. She came down the steps. He fell in beside her, not in front, not behind. Beside. They walked to the wagon together, and the space between them was the particular kind of close that had no distance left to close, only the decision to stop measuring it. Ruth took Clara so Eleanor could climb up into the wagon, and in the moment when Marsh's hand was at her elbow, steadying her, and she turned to take Clara back. Their eyes met in the plain, unhurried way they had begun to look at each other, without calculation, without management, with the simple, clear recognition of two people who had looked at each other steadily enough and long enough to see something true. She settled on the seat. He mounted his horse. Ruth clicked her own horses forward, and they moved out of Clearwater in the long golden afternoon. Clara slept the whole way home. Eleanor watched the road and felt the weight of her daughter in her arms and the warmth of the autumn sun on her face, and thought about the 40 acres waiting for her at the end of this road, her land paid for in 3 years of labor and 14 months of grief, and 2 weeks of the most precise and determined work she had ever done. She thought about the woman who had been plowing that field 9 weeks ago, belly swollen back, aching alone in the way that goes deeper than the absence of other people. The woman who had held on to the reins because holding on was all she knew how to do. She thought about what it had taken to let go of them, not in defeat, but in the deliberate recognition that strength and stubbornness were not the same thing, and that the most capable thing she had ever done was hand those reins to someone who understood what they were worth and plow the real field, the one that mattered, with everything she had. Marsh rode alongside the wagon and did not speak and did not need to. The cabin came into view as the sun reached the ridgeline, throwing long shadows across the field she had planted in spring, and that had grown, without her constant watch, into something that would see them through winter. The creek caught the last light. The cottonwood at the field's edge had begun to turn. Eleanor looked at all of it, her land standing whole, her daughter breathing warm and steady in her arms, the man riding beside her who had walked through her fence with the truth in his saddlebag, and the particular integrity of someone who could not carry it alone any longer, and had not stopped until he found the person who could use it. She had built something here. Not just the case, not just the 9 pages. Something that would last beyond a judge's ruling and a fraud stopped and a lien voided. Some things were worth fighting for with your whole self, your hands, your mind, your refusal to be made small. And some fights, when fought that way, became the foundation of everything that followed. Eleanor Cross had known that about land for 3 years. She was only now learning it was true about love as well.